Dr. KV Subramanian, Executive Director of IMF and former CEA, Chief Economic Advisor to the Prime Minister of India. Now, thank you so much, Doctor, for speaking to us. We have,
my pleasure, Rahul.
We have a fair mix of extremely persuasive debaters tonight, also well informed. So you'll have to make an impression on them, and that will depend a lot on the numbers that you today put out there for the public. Now, viewers, we're not going to make this dull and boring and statistical, but I will tell you that numbers are important because those are the ones that are constantly subject to scrutiny, and there is a big question mark put around them constantly. And today, let the numbers speak, even at the expense of being slightly boring. Dr. Ranganathan will perhaps lighten proceedings by injecting his dose of sarcasm. But look, viewers, let me bring in Dr. KV Subramanian. KV Subramanian, I remember speaking to you a few years ago, just after COVID, and you said we are going to emerge very strong. Now, what has led this growth? This is very encouraging. This is some good news.
Thank you very much, Rahul, and a very good evening to viewers. I am glad you bring that conversation up, Rahul. During COVID, I think one of the key things that India did was to identify the nature of the crisis very well. Every economic crisis usually is a big shock to demand, but the COVID crisis was also a big shock to supply. And India was sagacious enough to identify this, in March, April of 2020. And, one of the first slides that Morgan Stanley talks about, which is the supply side policies, were implemented because we identified the nature of the crisis. If we look at many of the other economies, almost none of them failed to identify, none of them could identify correctly that this crisis is going to be a big supply side shock. You have to keep in mind, Rahul, that unlike demand, where you give money and the money reaches hands, very quickly, almost instantaneously in the case of India because of the click of a button, supply side measures take time to manifest. If we initiate those measures, let's say today, maybe a year and a half from the time they are initiated, they actually, get implemented, because infrastructure does not grow up, overnight. And that is another aspect that had to be kept in mind. So I think this goes back to very sagacious, policy responses. India having not only the self-confidence, but also the courage of conviction to know that it has identified the crisis correctly, and therefore it will basically chart its own sui generis course, not just mimic what other countries did. If you allow me, I will contrast this, Rahul, with what we got during the global financial crisis. Then by mimicking what the advanced economies did, the typical copy-paste that economics that we used to do, we had the situation of India becoming part of the fragile five with the macros, whether it was fiscal deficit, current account deficit, inflation, all of them at very highs, and macro fundamentals being really in trouble. Growth also slowed down because we only did demand side measures at that time. I think the contrast in the way the country has responded to these crises, I think shows the ability to identify, think through, and have the foresight to implement the right measures. So it's very heartening to be able to see. Last point, I would say, even the 7.2% number for this year will get revised upwards. If you look at the evidence that has come the last 2 years, the upward revisions have been to the extent of 1.1%. So I think even this number, I think this will settle down at north of 7.5%, for FY23.